Americans pay the highest cost for healthcare globally, and in many cases get worse results. But we don't have to tell all of America this. We don't have to tell all of you this. You already know it. You're living it every single day. At the checkout line, in the pharmacy, the doctor's office, when you pay your electric or water bill. And here's what makes it work. You're doing everything right. You're working longer hours, picking up second jobs. You're cutting back in every way you can to make ends meet. You're skipping vacations. You're delaying buying a home. You're putting off starting a family. Some folks today are even skipping doses of medication just to stretch their prescription a few more days. This is not because you want to, but because you have no choice. You see no other way. A year ago, at his inauguration, our president promised lower prices and no more foreign wars. This administration has already spent $20 billion of your dollars waging war on Iran. And the war has gotten bigger, bloodier, and more expensive every day since. Just today, the Pentagon announced their plan to ask Congress for $200 billion to fund the war in Iran. $200 billion. That's money that we don't have. Our deficit last year was somewhere in the vicinity of $1.75 trillion. And yet, Congress is going to be asked to borrow $200 billion more, add that to the national debt. The SAVE Act isn't going to save any of that. It's not going to save any American any money. And it certainly isn't going to change reality. So what is it really about? I think it's about saving this administration's failing agenda. And how is that? It's through voter suppression. The president knows that costs are high. He knows that you're angry. He knows that the majority of Americans disapprove of the war, are unhappy that their costs keep rising. But instead of actually lowering prices, he's backing a bill that's going to make it harder for most people to vote, especially for Americans who he doesn't trust will vote for him. The Save America Act creates mountains of red tape for voters and will ultimately remove millions of Americans from the voting rolls. Republicans, Democrats, Independents. It requires every voter to dig through their basement, go up into their attic, and try to find their birth certificate, right? Find their passport, just so they can register to vote, something most of them have been doing year after year for decades. But there are problems, real problems, with this plan. More than 21 million Americans, 21 million American citizens don't have their original birth certificate handy, or they don't have a passport. They don't have either one of these types of identification. And 69 million married women have birth certificates that don't have their correct last name. They changed their name when they got married. Taken together, the Save America Act would make it more difficult for tens of millions of people to vote. It would also dismantle vote by mail as we know it. Now, about 1 in 3 Americans voted by mail in 2024, an election that President Trump won. During the 2024 election, the voters most likely to vote by mail were those over the age of 65. It's the single best way for folks with limited mobility to exercise their constitutional right. Just look at Colorado. Almost 99% of Republican voters in Colorado voted by mail in 2025. Now, way back in 2013, when I was still the governor, we passed a set of laws that established our state as the gold standard for secure and accessible elections. We started by making voting as accessible as possible. We established one of the first universal vote-by-mail systems in the country. Now, we still vote in person, but every single Coloradan gets a ballot mailed to them. Now, these reforms were largely created by Republican county clerks working with our Republican Secretary of State. Vote by mail has proven to be less expensive, more secure, and people love it. The turnout just goes up. It's perhaps the single most effective way to increase voter turnout. Today, as I said, every single registered voter gets a ballot in the mail. Every ballot that they receive in the mail is printed on paper, meaning that we have a physical record across the entire voting system that can be easily audited, even the faintest hint of fraud. And we go beyond that. I mean, it is basic common sense. The ballot arrives weeks before the election, gives Coloradans plenty of time to research the candidates, talk around the kitchen table who they think is going to do the best job, and submit their ballot by mail or go drop it off at a ballot box. And even if voters wait until the last minute, they can still register to vote and vote on election day. Now, Colorado Republicans were behind this initiative literally every step of the way, because this was about making voting, the act of voting, making that easier for everyone. Coloradans, Democrats, Republicans, independents, we have almost a third, actually we have more than a third independents now. Everybody loves this system. During the 2025 election, 98% of all the Coloradans who voted by mail. They submitted mail-in ballots. They dropped it off or they put it in the mail. And Coloradans didn't just make voting accessible, we made it secure. We created a multi-layered system of checks and balances. Every single ballot, every single drop box that receives ballots is under 24-hour video surveillance from the time the box opens for ballot return until the end of an election, day and night. We made sure Coloradans could track their ballot the same way you would use FedEx or UPS to track a package, so voters could trust that their ballot had been counted. And in 2017, under the leadership of Republican Secretary of State Wayne Williams, Colorado took election security to the next level. We became the first state in the nation to conduct a bipartisan statewide audit after every election. The results from these audits over the last 6 years show that Colorado's vote counting systems were more than 99.99% accurate. We put the burden on a team of Democratic and Republican leaders to use the state's resources, in other words, the state pays for this, to ensure that every person who votes is eligible and every vote counted matches the ballot. Now, the SAVE Act would completely reverse this progress. It would bog down the voter in endless mountains of new red tape. And in the end, millions of Americans wouldn't cast a ballot at all. Now think about and ask yourself who this really impacts. Seniors who no longer drive, rural Americans who live hours from a government office. These are likely Republican voters, but it's going to impact them negatively. It will impact working parents who can't take time off to track down paperwork or take work off to vote in person. It would impact women whose last names have changed, as I mentioned. At the end of the day, none of it helps you, the voter. It's all a distraction, a rather large distraction. I mean, every hour that we're spending in the debate about the Save America Act is an hour we're not spending bringing down the cost of groceries or housing, healthcare. While Americans are worried and continue to worry, and they are worried, while Americans are worried about costs, they're worried about their families and their future, the administration is relitigating the 2020 election and waging a war most Americans don't want. All of this chaos, from Colorado to Venezuela to Iran to Minnesota, it's one big distraction from this administration's failure to lower costs for Americans. The bill was never about saving Americans money. They call it the SAVE Act, creates a misrepresentation. But what we should be here today to accomplish is to figure out how to save money for the Americans, American people, for all of you. If your agenda is working and you're delivering on promises, you don't have to make it harder for people to vote. I would argue that agenda might not be working. I think the results, if your agenda is working, and the people speak for themselves. So let me spell it out. Americans want lower costs. Not wars abroad, not violence in the streets. Americans are looking literally for any sign that this administration still sees them, still sees the rising grocery costs, the gas prices, the huge bill increases from doctors' offices. Excuse me. This administration refuses to acknowledge these problems exist. And there's so much infighting within the president's ranks that they can't decide whether this war will go on for 2 weeks or 5 weeks or a year. Are American troops going to be deployed? The jury's still out on that as well. It's a lot of noise and not a lot of substance. So far, there's no evidence for a comprehensive plan. And certainly no, and by that I mean zero, accountability to the American people. Let's remember, the Pentagon just announced their plan to ask Congress for $200 billion to fund the war in Iran. They want the American taxpayers to sign off on borrowing, because we don't have the cash, to borrow $200 billion more money. $200 billion more. With that kind of money, we can fund universal pre-K in every state in this country. We can get to universal health care coverage. We could have free school meals for every child, free community college for every American for a full year. So when they shout out the importance of the SAVE Act, remember this one thing. It will not help you save a penny on your rent, your groceries, the cost of your health care. The only thing it's saving, I would argue, is their political skin. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I'd like to note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
You're watching live Senate coverage of the America Save Act here on the Chop Shop with your nighttime, right time DJ, DJ Music. Hey there, Brucey. Hey there, ABT. Hey, listen, Brucey, I'll be free tomorrow, so we're gonna hook up tomorrow. If you can hear me, drop a 1 or 2 in the chat room there. Again, folks, we're watching live coverage of the Senate debating the Save America Act. As you heard the prior speaker say, that this will not save anyone any money. It will not make the cost of your rent lower or anything. I feel it's necessary, instead of us debating this, to get this type of information straight from the horse's mouth, meaning the United States Senate. Let's get back to it. But yeah, Brucey, I'll definitely get in contact with you tomorrow, and we'll chop it up a little bit about what we spoke on earlier. Again, folks, we're watching live Senate coverage of the SAVED Act. I would suggest that we let the what's that Project 2025 go through our midst without watching it and without adhering to it. So I think it's time that we all see it from the horse's mouth instead of talking about it on our prospective channels. Let's watch the Senate talk about it, and we'll see who's right and who's wrong. So far, the Republicans have got up and argued of why we should fund ICE. As you can see, for this war in Iran that's been less than a month ongoing, it's they're now asking for $200 billion in money, but yet no money for schools, no money for food, no money for this, no money for that when it comes to taking care of the American citizens. But yet they got money for bombs and wars. I believe Tupac said that, didn't he? Absolutely, Brucey. That's part of it. Excuse me. That's part of it as well. To where the part one guy with this guy, the last speaker was debating on, especially for women that are married. If you haven't, say you've been married over 30 years or 20 years, chances are that the name on your driver's license is not going to match the name on your birth certificate. And not too many of us walk around with a handy copy of our birth certificate as well. So when you go to register to vote, they're going to require those things. And again, you heard the senator point out earlier that there's going to be a whole range of folks that gets summarily kicked off voter rolls simply because their name don't match what their birth certificate matches.
Gentleman yields. Ms. Stefanik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Gabbard, when you began your testimony, you stated that your remarks do not represent your personal beliefs. That's the first time I've heard that at a committee hearing. Why did you say that? Or is there anything in the threat assessment that you personally disagree with?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. The reason I've said that is twofold. Number one is when I assumed this role as Director of National Intelligence through the confirmation process and beyond, many members of Congress rightly said Your personal views and your politics in this role get checked at the door. And as Director of National Intelligence, my responsibility is to report the intelligence community's assessments objectively and to make sure that they are not politicized in any way, shape, or form. Unfortunately, there are those who, for one reason or another, have tried to mischaracterize the intelligence community's assessments and saying, well, this is just a political view, or trying to misdirect from what the intelligence community is reporting. So I took the opportunity to state that from the outset, that this is the intelligence community's assessments.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask this because this week there was a high-profile resignation of Director of National Counterterrorism Center. Now, I want to be clear from the outset. I've communicated directly with President Trump my support for Operation Epic Fury, and I was very not only disappointed, but how inappropriate this letter was. And I want to read a statement that and get your personal assessment, whether you agree or disagree with that. And that's this. Early in this administration, high-ranking Israeli officials and influential members of the American media deployed a misinformation campaign that wholly undermined your America First platform and pro-war sentiments to encourage a war with Iran. This echo chamber was used to deceive you into believing that Iran posed no imminent threat to the United States and that you should strike now. There was a clear path to a swift victory. This was a lie and is the same tactic the Israelis used to draw us into a disastrous Iraq war. Now, I cannot say how much I disagree with that statement. Do you agree or disagree with what this letter was put out by former Director Kent?
He said a lot of things in that letter. Ultimately, we have provided the president with the intelligence assessments, and the president is elected by the American people and makes his own decisions based on the information that's available to him.
But do you agree with, does that statement he made, blaming Israel, concern you?
Yes.
My next question is, I want to touch on the rise of terrorist attacks on the homeland. In the month of March alone, there were multiple high-profile Islamic terrorist attacks. You had Temple Israel Synagogue in Michigan. You had in Texas, you had an ISIS-inspired attack where they threw an IED in New York City. What is your assessment as to the rise of Islamic terrorism on the homeland?
As you've pointed to, Congresswoman, this continues to be an extreme concern, not only because of the rise of these attacks, but the mechanisms which they're carried out and the challenges that the intelligence community has in being able to try to detect some of these threats and attacks in advance. I'd like to defer to the FBI director on some of this because they have been very successful in many cases over the last year in detecting them and preventing these attacks. But due to the nature of the challenge in many of these attackers not having contact with known foreign terrorist entities or individuals, makes this a much more challenging threat to deal with.
And I want to turn to Director Patel. I think that's a good, important segue to get your assessment. And I also want to add another aspect of the question. We're working on a 9/11 Commission review, 25-year review. What other tools do you need to make sure that we are able to have the most robust, effective CT efforts?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. Just real quick. So last year we had 2,300 arrests related to foreign terrorist organizations. We had 700 counterterrorism arrests, and the FBI had 640 counterterrorism disruptions where we.
Maybe one other explanation. So you remember back, Mr. President, when the president spoke at the State of the Union, he asked for all the members of the audience there assembled before him in front of the whole country to stand if you support law enforcement and public safety and not illegal immigrants. All Republicans stood, all Democrats sat on their hands. And I found it particularly telling when some of the TV camera zoomed in on some of the Democrats who were very, if I'm interpreting their body language correctly, they were very uncomfortable because they knew that what they were doing was wrong, but they felt like for some reason they had to do it. And then there's the decision of the president to eliminate the nuclear weapons program of the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is the #1 state sponsor of international terrorism. They've had American blood on their hands for 47 years since the Iranian Revolution. Produced these explosively formed penetrators that killed or maimed service members of the United States over many years. Their proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Shia militias, they have American blood on their hands. And the Biden administration and previous administrations knew that they aspired to have a nuclear weapon. Now, I cannot imagine anything worse than the #1 state sponsor of terrorism getting a nuclear weapon. They're committed to the death of Israel. They want to wipe Israel off the map, but they've also chanted death to America. What is it about that we don't understand and believe? And thank goodness President Trump had the courage, political and otherwise, and the confidence in the United States military to do what needed to be done in order to protect our own troops in the Middle East and help prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. What do our Democratic colleagues do? They said, well, Trump started a war and there's no identifiable end state, so we oppose what President Trump is doing. So Trump derangement syndrome causes people to do really strange things, to take the side of the #1 state sponsor of international terrorism that wants a nuclear weapon, to cause members of Congress to sit on their hands rather than to support and applaud our law enforcement personnel that keep our communities safe. And now we see this happening at our airports across the country, where because of Democratic obstruction, our TSA agents, the people who are maintaining security at the airports, they now miss 2 paychecks. And for what good reason could that be? Well, I think it's Trump derangement syndrome. They know that President Trump wants the Department of Homeland Security funded, which means they automatically, reflexively don't want it funded. And they frankly don't care who they hurt. It's shameful. It ought to be embarrassing. But some people can't be embarrassed. So Democrats are now forced into a strange posture on this Save America Act, which requires proof of citizenship to vote and proof of identification in order to cast your ballot. Democrats are forced into the awkward position of saying they should block this legislation that so many of their own constituents apparently want and agree with. I have to say, listening to some of the what passes for arguments on the other side, I find myself unpersuaded by their fear-mongering. I remember I asked in the Judiciary Committee the other day, I asked the ranking member, the Democratic whip, Senator Durbin from Illinois, I said, what is it that what Democrats dislike about the Save America Act? He said, well, it will disenfranchise people. Well, not if you can show you're an American citizen, not if you have photo ID. You're not going to be disenfranchised. So that must mean that you're worried about disenfranchising non-citizens, illegal immigrants. You're worried about disenfranchising the election cheat who wouldn't be required to show photo ID, but yet casts a ballot pretending to be someone they're not. 2 days ago, Minority Leader Schumer came to the Senate floor and said, the SAVE Act is not about election integrity. It is voter suppression. Well, he's half right. It's illegal voter suppression. But his general argument that American citizens would be denied the opportunity to vote is patently false. 38 states, including states like Georgia and Rhode Island, currently represented by Democrats, require voter ID. Are those states suppressing the vote? Is the minority leader suggesting that 38 out of our 50 states are actively engaged in voter suppression? Well, that's preposterous on its face. Some states, like my state, Texas, requires voters to show an ID with an option to sign an affidavit alongside of a secondary form of ID to establish their identity. In other words, we make it easy. So the idea that the Save America Act will disenfranchise legitimate voters is a bald-faced, well, let me try to be generous. It's not true. And he knows it. The Democratic leader knows that's false, but he has the temerity to stand up here on the Senate floor and to tell people who may not be informed about the details of this that we are trying to take away their right to vote. Well, it's the Democrats who are diluting your vote, if you're a qualified voter, by allowing non-citizens or people who engage in election fraud the opportunity to vote. They're diluting your vote, making it less valuable. So the Save America Act will not disenfranchise legitimate voters. It will simply universalize ID requirements so that all 50 states will play by the same rules. Another charge that we're hearing is that, well, it's just too hard to prove you're an American citizen because you need a passport. You'll need a passport to vote, and any requirement that you need a passport will be too burdensome. Well, of course, anybody who's traveled will have a passport, of course. But once again, this argument that you need a passport to vote is not true. The Save America Act allows Americans to prove their citizenship by a variety of documents, including but not limited to a passport. Americans can present an enhanced driver's license, a real ID compliant driver's license, or a state ID card, all of which are sufficient under this bill to prove you're an American citizen. I have a real ID driver's license in my pocket, as do most driver's licenses. We've required post 9/11 to prevent terrorists from getting false identities and traveling on our airplanes and blowing them out of the sky. We required that states eventually require a real ID, which just has a radio frequency chip in it that's hard to counterfeit, so that we have assurance that people who produce a driver's license with a real ID in it are who they say they are. So you don't need a passport. You can use a military identification card. You can use a certificate of naturalization. If you weren't born in this country but became, by grace of God, an American citizen. Furthermore, if an American does not have any of the above, they can pair a photo ID with their birth certificate, a consular report of birth abroad, or similar documents. In other words, there's a lot of different ways that people can establish that they are qualified to vote. Finally, and perhaps the most outrageous charge that our Democratic colleagues have been flinging at us is that married women, we're going to disenfranchise married women whose birth certificate does not reflect their current married name. They won't be able to vote. Well, that would be foolish if that were true. As somebody who is not only married for 46 years, but the father of 2 adult daughters, I promise I would be the last person on the planet to tell a woman she has no right to vote. So this is nothing but a scare tactic. Certainly, it's easy to be able to establish based on a marriage license or something else that some other qualifying document that your birth certificate name is different than your married name. So this is nothing more than a scare tactic by our colleagues who want what? Why are they objecting to this? Well, let me put it less charitably. They want to make it easier for people to cheat. That's a harsh statement, but you tell me what the other alternatives are. They want to make it easier to cheat. The reality is that the Save America Act provides a process for anyone who changes their legal name for reasons of marriage or otherwise to register to vote. And anyone who's already registered to vote at the time they change their name would just have to update their voter registration. Well, I think women, voters, should be offended that somehow they're not capable of being able to identify themselves either with a marriage license or a birth certificate, or that it's just too hard for them. They can't figure it out. That's insulting. Well, I have full confidence that American citizens who happen to be female, who go through these heroic efforts to keep our businesses running and take care of our families, I have full confidence they'll be capable of updating their voter registration to match their new married name. To listen to our Democratic colleagues, you would think the American people are incapable of thinking for themselves or are incapable of simply locating these legal documents. And we're not doing this for frivolous reasons. It's because apparently our Democratic colleagues think that non-citizens should be allowed to vote, and that election fraudsters should be able to vote without proving their identity. On the behalf of the 32 million Texans I represent, I find this argument deeply offensive. America is the greatest place on earth. What we have here is the envy of people around the world who want to come here because of the opportunities that this great country provides. One of the most important aspects of America is that our laws are passed by elected representatives and that our laws are legitimized by the consent of the governed, who cast a vote on behalf of those office holders, the members of Congress, on their behalf. And these are positions of trust that we hold, but the authority comes from the voters and comes from the citizens, not illegal immigrants, not election fraudsters. That undermines the very foundation upon which the legitimacy of our government rests. I think a country with citizens bright enough to put a man on the moon and to build the strongest, most powerful military in the world and the greatest economy the world has ever known, I think those folks are smart enough and capable enough to be able to locate their driver's license when they cast a ballot and to establish their citizenship in order to qualify to vote. Any suggestion to the contrary is ridiculous. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Committees. 5 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They've been approved by the minority and majority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsterbrooks.
You're watching live Senate coverage of the Save America Act. Right now, they are in a roll call. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the broadcast here. We are broadcasting live on YouTube. Give it about another 30, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll see what goes on from there. All right, ladies and gentlemen, again, thank everybody for tuning in. And if you're just checking in or just riding around and about, please be safe here on the streets.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Tennessee.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. President, I dropped the microphone there. I ask that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, it is so interesting that we're finding ourselves here on a Thursday, and one of the pressing issues is DHS funding for Homeland Security. And I find it so interesting that my colleagues across the aisle continue to be given to this concept that they have grown over the last few years. And it is that we need to defund federal law enforcement and we need to abolish ICE. And of course, we know they have made this commitment to their leftist base that what they're going to do is find a way to go through defunding federal law enforcement and abolishing ICE. And to them, that is the Holy Grail. So let's look at what this actually would do. I think it's important to note that the Department of Homeland Security, that ICE is already funded, fully funded, and will be fully funded through 2029. Now, they can rant and rave all day long, but nothing is going to change that. That is already there. We did that this summer, and it was in the big, beautiful bill, working family tax cut, but of course, they all voted no. No one on the Democrat side voted for that, even though it was the largest tax cut in our nation's history. So they obviously never read the bill to find out what was in the bill. But one would think that with this much time having passed, that they would be aware that ICE is fully funded. Now, what they are doing is prohibiting funding from FEMA, Secret Service, the Coast Guard, and other components of Homeland Security. And FEMA makes up 35% of the DHS budget. And Mr. President, I just think it is so important to note TSA is not being paid. And this is now day 35 that the Democrats have said to TSA and to the American people, we are going to use you as our pawns because we want to make certain that we are defunding federal law enforcement and we're abolishing ICE. So our TSA workers are out there working without a paycheck because of this singular focus of our friends across the aisle. I encourage them to set this aside. We need to make certain that Homeland Security investigations, that TSA, that FEMA, that the Coast Guard, that the Secret Service are all receiving appropriate funding, and that we make certain DHS, Homeland Security, has the funds to keep this nation safe. I yield the floor.
I recognize the senator from North Carolina.
Mr. President, I rise today to honor the life, service, and long-awaited homecoming of Private Luther LaRue Dusty Rhodes of Eddyville, Henderson County, North Carolina, a United States Marine who gave his life in defense of our nation during World War II. Luther Rhodes was born in Eddyville on March 22nd, 1924, and raised on his family's farm in the Blue Ridge, Appalachian Mountains, by his parents, Harley and Lexine Rhodes, alongside 9 brothers and sisters. From an early age, Luther learned the values of hard work, devotion to family, responsibility to others, values that shaped the man that he would become and guided his decision to serve his country. At just 17 years old, Luther was determined to enlist. After receiving his father's permission, he joined the United States Marine Corps on November 11th, 1941, just weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor. He completed recruit training at Parris Island and was assigned to L Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine, 1st Marine Division at New River, now Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. In late May 1942, Private Rhodes deployed to New Zealand and soon thereafter took part in the amphibious landings on Guadalcanal on August 7th, 1942, the first major American offensive of the war in the Pacific. His unit captured Henderson Field and then endured months of sustained, often brutal combat, including Bloody Ridge and battles now along the Matanikau River. And during this period, Luther became known among his fellow Marines as the Kid and by his nickname, Dusty. He was young and slight, with light blonde hair and a boyish face, but he demonstrated courage and resolve beyond his years. He earned the respect of the men with whom he served. On the night of October 7th, 1942, during the Third Battle of the Matanikau, Japanese forces attempted to break through the Marine lines. In the darkness and the confusion of that engagement, Luther Rhodes was killed in action. He was 18 years old. His fellow Marines recovered his body the following morning. And one of them, Lawrence Hard Rock Gherkin, who had taken Luther under his wing, was informed personally of the young Marine's death. When Gherkin saw Luther's body wrapped in a poncho, he was overcome with grief. He ordered the men carrying him to handle him with care. Decades later, those who witnessed that moment still recalled how Luther's blonde hair appeared alongside the battlefield. But the chaos of the war and the movement of his remains afterwards created lasting uncertainty. Luther's body was buried in a temporary Marine cemetery on Guadalcanal, but his remains were never returned home. In 1949, he was declared permanently non-recoverable. His parents wrote to the Marine Corps in 1946, pleading for information and expressing their hope that their son could one day be returned to the United States for his final resting place. Their youngest son, Marvin, grew up never knowing his brother. Luther died when Marvin was just 6 months old. For decades, Marvin searched for answers. He submitted DNA. He attended briefings. He followed every lead that he could. And eventually, he lost hope that his brother would ever be found. Then, last year in 2025, the phone rang. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency had identified Luther Rhodes from remains buried at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu. Advances in DNA technology had finally made it possible. After 83 years, Luther was coming home. And for the people of Henderson County, that news meant something deep. It meant a son of the mountains who left home as a teenager to serve his country was finally coming back to the hills that raised him. Next weekend, Luther Rhodes will be laid to rest at Edneyville United Methodist Church near his parents and siblings in the soil they prayed he would one day return to, back in the Appalachian Mountains among his own people. That identification came through persistence, careful research, and an unwavering commitment to the principle that no American service member should ever be forgotten. It came through the extraordinary work of the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. It came through the advocacy of the Hedrick Rhodes VFW Post 5206 in Hendersonville, and it came through the determination of family members and community leaders who refused to abandon the search. To Marvin Rhodes and the entire Rhodes family, the people of North Carolina honor your brother. We honor your sacrifice, and we are grateful that Luther is finally coming home. Mr. President, I ask that my colleagues join me in honoring Private Luther LaRue Dusty Rhodes, United States Marine Corps, and in reaffirming our commitment to never cease our efforts to account for those who remain missing in action. May God bless the memory of Luther Rhodes, and may God bless the United States of America.
I recognize the senator from Hawaii. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alston-Brooks.
Mr. President,
I recognize the senator from Tennessee.
I ask that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I had spoken a little bit earlier about what was happening with Homeland Security funding. And one of the things that we are hearing from so many school groups and church groups, people that and families that were coming up for spring break, is their disappointment with these long lines at the airport and difficulty in making those travel arrangements. And again, Mr. President, I think it is so important to encourage our colleagues across the aisle to accept some of the concessions and the offers that have been made to them in order to fully fund DHS and focus on our nation's security. But as I mentioned earlier, They choose not to do that because they want to abolish ICE. And that is their North Star right now. That is their guiding principle. They are all about abolishing ICE. So let's look at what that would mean. One of the things that we have learned from the American people is they wanted to see our nation's border closed. They wanted to make certain that we, the American people, know who is coming into our country and why they are coming into our country. We know that we want to be certain that people are not coming here with ill intent. Now, we have seen this play out. We know for a fact that there are about 18,000 known terrorists that came in during the 4 years of the Joe Biden administration. Many of these people came in with criminal records. We know that they are on these terrorist watch lists. We know that they have moved across our country and that the Department of Homeland Security has been locating these individuals, moving to apprehend these individuals, to detain them, to prosecute them, and to get them out of our country. Now, interestingly enough, the vast majority of the American people agree with that process. They agree that these are individuals that should be removed from the country. And Mr. President, it is really quite amazing to me. In Tennessee, I have not talked to one single person, not one, who says, Marcia, you know what? I hope we get more terrorists moving into our neighborhood. Or, Marcia, I hope we have more gangs, more drug dealers, more drug traffickers, more human traffickers, more sex traffickers, more pedophiles, wanting them in their communities. They don't want that. And there is a good reason for that. The people in this country value public safety. They value that. They want our nation to be safe. They want our communities to be safe. They want to make certain that we are going to have a safe environment in which to live. Public safety, defending our country. That's kind of at the top of the to-do list when you talk with people about their expectations of the activities we're going to take out. There's another thing that is at the top of their to-do list, and that has to do with the Save America Act that is before us right now. This legislation, Mr. President, holds two provisions that the majority of the American people agree with. Democrats give it a 71% thumbs up approval rating. Independents approve it by about 85%, and over 90% of Republicans approve this. And it's really quite simple. It really is common sense. Common sense, obviously, to Democrats all across the country, independents all across the country, Republicans all across the country, but to the Democrats in this chamber, Mr. President, they say, oh, no, 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 don't you don't. The two provisions are this. Number one, if you are going to register to vote in a U.S. election, you have to prove that you are indeed a U.S. citizen. Very common sense. We don't allow people that are not citizens to register to vote because they're not a citizen. Now, if you were to follow the illogic that is on display from many of my colleagues across the aisle, you would hear them say, well, we need to allow these individuals to be a part of the community. Well, you know what? They are illegally in the country. They do not have a right to vote. They should not register to vote. But we've got 19 states, 19 in this country, 19 states that will allow people that are illegally in the country to get a driver's license. Well, what does that have to do with voter registration? Because of the motor voter law, Mr. President, what they will do is get that driver's license and then they check that little box that says they can register to vote or they want to register to vote. And then the responsibility of getting them off that registration goes to your state registrar of elections, because they're going to have to match up their voter rolls against the list of individuals that are in the country illegally and make certain they're not there. States also can clean up these rolls by making certain that what they're doing is checking it against the IRS Social Security death rolls. This is how you make certain that your rolls are accurate. And that indeed is what needs to be done to ensure that people who are eligible to register to vote are the only ones who are registering to vote. Now, there is another thing that can be done to help with making certain that we're respecting citizens, respecting the one person, one vote, and making certain that we are respecting that right to cast that ballot. And that is having individuals who are going to the poll to vote to actually show their ID. Now, in Tennessee, we do this. This is standard process for us in Tennessee. And by the way, we clean up and verify our rolls. We make certain that we are doing that. We check them against the Social Security and the DHS rolls. And we are certain that people are a citizen. Makes sense, doesn't it? If you're going to vote, you got to be a citizen. And when people go to the polls, they take that photo ID and they show that ID before they cast that ballot. Mr. President, this is an action that shows respect. It shows respect for one person, one vote. It shows respect for the process. It shows respect for our citizens. The Save America Act and what it embodies with making certain that people prove they are who they are when they go to that poll, that people prove they are indeed a citizen of this great nation, the greatest nation on the face of the earth, and that they are thereby entitled to register to vote. These are actions that certainly are there to help protect that process. And we want to make certain that the Save America Act is passed, that it makes it to President Trump's desk, and that it is indeed signed into law. And Mr. President, I think that all of our colleagues across the aisle, when you look at the fact that 71% of the Democrats support this, 85% of the independents support this. 90-something% of the Republicans support this. So it leads you to ask the question, what are they afraid of? Well, one of the things that we continue to look at is, as we talk about elections, we should make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. And verification, clean rolls, respecting that process, yes, indeed, that is going to make it easier to vote. It's going to make it harder to cheat. That is something that the Save America Act would accomplish. But our colleagues across the aisle are fearful of that. So I would encourage my friends to think long and hard, Mr. President. What are they afraid of with the Save America Act? Are they concerned that it would eliminate fraud? Are they concerned that it would clean up elections? Are they concerned that our counties and states might verify and clean up those voter rolls? Why would they not want to do this? I was doing a telephone town hall with Tennesseans the other night, and we had several thousand on the phone, and a gentleman asked this question, and he said, I don't get this. What are the Democrats afraid of with the Save America Act? And I told him, I said, you know what? I don't get it either. Because if we want to preserve one person, one vote, if we want to make certain we are protecting your right to make certain your vote counts, then these two steps would go a long way to giving individuals the confidence that they want to know that their elections are going to be fair. And in Tennessee, we've been ranked as we're ranked as #1 in election integrity. We go through all these steps, and it would be a wise move for other states to begin through this process. I would encourage these 19 states that don't require you to show identification, or either don't require you to show citizenship, or don't require documentation to register as they're going to vote. I would require them to look very closely at this, to respect the voter, and to make certain their roles are cleared. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Roll.
Ms. Alston Brooks.
Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching live Senate coverage of the Save America Act. here on the Chop Shop with your nighttime, right time DJ Music. Hey, Shar, how you doing? Welcome to all the good folks that's hanging out here with me watching this live Senate coverage. Look like they're back. Let's get back to the show.
Unanimous consent to use a framed photograph as an exhibit during my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've been saying all week, colleagues, that Democrats would be here on the floor fighting this Republican voter suppression bill, this so-called Save America Act, tooth and nail for as long as it takes. And we're keeping that promise because Republicans are trying to pull off this bait and switch for the American people. Let me be clear, this bill is anything but a voter ID bill. If you're a married woman who chose to change her name when she got married, you could be kept from registering to vote under this bill. If this bill were to pass, vote by mail, that option would be gone. No excuse, absentee voting, that too would be gone. Your driver's license, which most people think would be sufficient under a voter ID law to access the ballot box, not good enough anymore. Why? It's because the American people are tired and angry about the Donald Trump disastrous agenda, the failures of the Republican majority to improve their lives. And instead of facing the consequences of their actions and owning their record, they want to change the rules of our elections to avoid consequences from the voters. And I can't help but note the timing of this debate. 61 years ago this week, President Lyndon Johnson came to the Capitol and addressed a joint session of Congress, delivering a powerfully important message to his fellow Americans, a message that is still resonating to this very day. He said, quote, "Rarely are we met with a challenge, not to our growth or abundance, our welfare or our security, but rather to the values and the purposes and the meaning of our beloved nation." A challenge to the values and the purposes and the meaning of our nation. That's a pretty good summary of what's happening this week. President Johnson went on to say, and again I quote, "Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no reason which can excuse the denial of that right. There is no duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right." End quote. President Johnson was speaking not just to Congress, but to America in the days after Bloody Sunday, when civil rights activists, including former Congressmember John Lewis, when they were violently attacked and beaten crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge as they marched for the right to vote. Now, many of us have treasured memories with John Lewis. And Mr. President, I keep this photo in my office where it inspires me every single day. In the weeks that followed Bloody Sunday, our country and Congress rose to meet the moment. And coming together, Congress passed one of the most significant pieces in our nation's history, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Yet here we are today, debating a bill that would turn back the clock, that would do so much to deny so many their most fundamental right as Americans, our right to vote. That's shameful. In this country, the right to vote is a sacred thing. After casting our ballots, so many people are so proud to share with their friends, share with the public that they have participated in our democracy. They've done their civic duty. They wear buttons, they wear stickers, which is why we cannot allow these efforts to restrict voter access that are at the heart of this bill. Now, doing so would be an enormous and dangerous step backwards. Under, again, the so-called Save America Act, all 50 states would be required to send their voter rolls, including a lot of private information of voters, to the Department of Homeland Security. I spoke a couple of days ago as to why the Department of Homeland Security is the last entity you would want handling this vital information. Now, once there, known election deniers who have been appointed by the administration would certainly run these lists through the Department of Homeland Security's SAVE program, different kind of SAVE than the name of this bill, the SAVE program, and they would then give back to states lists of names of voters that should be removed from their lists. And colleagues, as you know, a substitute amendment has been filed for the Save America Act that's before us that now forces further reliance on unreliable data from the Social Security Administration. Now, it wasn't that long ago that we discovered that data was being misused by DOGE with a secret agreement to share the data that they got their hands on with outside political groups seeking to overturn election results. So my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, let me be abundantly clear with this point. This is not an accusation. Trump's Department of Justice has admitted to this in court. And here's another admission that the administration has made. Quote, due to misspellings of names, transposed numbers, or incomplete information, the SAVE program may produce inaccurate results. End quote. Again, this is not theoretical. This is not an accusation. It is happening right now. 12 states have chosen or have been politically pressured to cooperate by providing the Trump administration with their voter rolls. And there's been analysis and review of how this demonstration is going. NPR reports that as of December, the information of more than 47 million voters have been run through the SAVE program at DHS. And that means the administration is already flagging American citizens, eligible American voters, to be purged from the rolls. And colleagues, you know what happens when a voter has been purged from the rolls. The burden falls on the voter to undo it, to navigate bureaucracy in order to prove their citizenship once again, and to register to vote once again. But many won't even know there's a problem until they show up on election day and they're turned away because even though they've been voting there for years and years and years, all of a sudden they're not on the list. Texas is one of those 12 states. And again, the review of the activity that's already happening by DHS and this so-called SAVE program, in Travis County, 25% of the flagged names had already proven their citizenship. 1 in 4 voters. And in Boone County, Missouri, another state that's participating, more than half of the voters that DHS told those states to remove were citizens. So let that sink in for a moment. 25 to 50% of the names were flagged in error. 1 in 4 voters, half of voters. Can you see how this would be a huge problem? Eligible voters being removed from the rolls and even referred to DHS for possible criminal investigation. That's the broken system that Donald Trump wants to use to maintain voter rolls nationwide. And that's the question being posed to the Senate and to Congress. I know how Democrats are responding. So the question is really, is this what Republicans want too? And as you look through the rest of the bill, you know that this SAVE program utilization is not the only problem. And we don't have to guess as to what the strict documentation requirements would cause if imposed on the voters. Look no further than the state of Kansas, when they tried something very similar to this just a few years ago. 31,000 eligible citizens blocked from registering to vote. 31,000 eligible citizens blocked in Kansas. If I was a senator from Kansas, I'd be up in arms. Or look to New Hampshire. Hundreds of voters were turned away last year under a recently enacted state law because they didn't have a passport or a birth certificate on hand when they went to the polls. The very types of requirements in the language of the bill before us. Joshua Bogdan was one of those voters. In the late afternoon on election day, he turned up at his polling site to vote, only to be turned away because all he had on him was his driver's license that day. He had to race home and frantically search for his passport, then race back to the polls before they closed. Thankfully, he was able to vote that day. But he admitted later that if there was anything that might have delayed him, having to take longer to find the passport, maybe getting caught up in traffic, he would not have been able to cast his vote. He would have been denied his fundamental right to vote. Now, I've also heard some of the sponsors of this bill say, oh, don't worry, if you don't have the proper paperwork at hand, there's going to be a separate process. And they replied to me, well, just read the bill. Well, guess what? I have read the bill. And I'll tell you about this last minute provision, this last minute affidavit process that's been inserted into the bill to try to provide cover for those hiding behind the true intent. The fact of the matter is that there's no clear standards for this alternate process that they're pointing to. There's no clear explanation to how it would work. All we do know is that if this bill were to pass and be signed by the president, it would go into effect immediately. So let's be clear about what's fundamentally happening here. Maintaining accurate voter rolls is vital for our elections. It requires precision. It requires transparency. Trust me, I served as California Secretary of State prior to coming to the Senate. Nobody understands this in this body better than I do. But I also understand that transparency, that precision is not in this bill. Instead, this bill creates a system where mistakes are inevitable. And if mistakes are inevitable, then it is inevitable that people will be denied their fundamental right to vote. There's a reason, colleagues, that President Johnson and civil rights leaders came to push so hard for the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. It was to move our country forward, not backward. But this bill, this so-called Save America Act, would be a huge step backwards for our country. Democrats are prepared to meet this challenge. We'll continue opposing this bill. I'll say it again, today, tonight, tomorrow, for as long as it takes. Nothing is more fundamental in our democracy than the right to vote, and we will do everything in our power to protect it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Nevada.
Thank you. Mr. President, I rise today to express my strong opposition to the Save America Act. let me be clear right off the bat. I believe in protecting the integrity of our elections. I believe our elections should be and are safe and secure. And I believe we must always make sure there is no meddling in our elections. Every eligible American deserves to have their voice heard at the ballot box, and they deserve to have confidence in our democratic system. So this is not a Democrat or Republican value. Free and fair elections are the foundation of the United States of America. And protecting these free and fair elections should be something every elected official should support. But that's not what this bill is really about. It's not what this bill is really about. The hyper-partisan so-called Save America Act, it isn't about making our elections any safer. It's not even about keeping our elections free and fair. It's quite the opposite. This bill is about making it harder for eligible Americans to vote and shrinking the size of our electorate to benefit Republicans. This bill would impose strict restrictions on Americans' ability to vote, restrictions so severe that a woman who gets married and changes her last name could be barred from voting because her last name doesn't match her birth certificate. Think about that. You take your husband's name, now you can't vote because your current last name doesn't match your birth certificate. You know, you see Donald Trump and Washington Republicans, they're so afraid of being held accountable for their actions and their jobs and what they're doing, that they're trying anything that they can possibly do to prevent people from voting in order to increase their odds in this year's midterm elections. They know their actions to raise gas prices, cut your health care, increase costs through illegal tariffs, groceries up, rent up, utilities up. They are not popular with the American people. And that's why Trump first tried to rig congressional maps in red states like Texas and Missouri to give Republicans an advantage. And when that didn't work, Washington Republicans, well, they decided to push a hyper-partisan bill. You heard me right. Instead of working to improve your lives, to improve lives of Americans by lowering costs at the kitchen table, by expanding access to health care, and face the voters on the merits of their work, they would just rather restrict the electorate. In other words, they just want to stop people from voting. And at a time when families are struggling, we're struggling to make ends meet, when people are being squeezed by rising prices at the grocery store, now at the gas pump going higher and higher every day, well, and at the doctor's office, if you still have insurance. Washington Republicans have chosen to focus all of their efforts, every single one of them, on preventing people from voting. Washington Republicans not lowering your costs. They're not helping working families get ahead. Instead, they're making it harder for Americans to exercise their constitutional right to vote. So let's not kid ourselves here. Washington Republicans are using this totally unnecessary and harmful bill, well, as a distraction from the fact that families are struggling to keep up with the rising costs of their lives, a distraction from the fact that gas prices are going up every single day, a distraction that groceries are more expensive, and they're going up every single day along with the price of gas. It's a distraction from the fact that too many Americans are just worried about how they're going to afford their health care and their medication and what tough choices they may have to make in order to make ends meet. These are the things that really keep people up at night, and these are the things that the Senate should be focused on. And so Trump and Washington Republicans have done absolutely nothing to lower the price of your groceries or your gas, and nothing to make sure that your health care is more affordable. Washington Republicans simply don't care about your monthly bills going up and up. Instead, we're debating a bill that does absolutely nothing to make life more affordable for anyone. So what should we be doing? We should be working together to protect against real threats to our elections, like foreign interference, voter intimidation, and making sure that every legal vote is counted, not creating new obstacles for Americans who are simply trying to exercise their constitutional right to vote. We should be working together to address real threats and the real challenges that American families are facing today. I said, taking care of your family, kids going to school, rent, groceries, utilities, opportunity. We should be working together to address those financial pressures that families are under, to come up with the good solutions, good policies that will actually make a real difference for people in their lives at their kitchen table. And that's really what we've been elected to do. And so we owe it to the voters to do that, and we also owe it to the voters to protect their right to vote in future elections. So to be clear, I will not support policies that make it harder for eligible Americans to vote. And so I urge my colleagues to reject the Save America Act and get back to focusing on what actually matters to the American people, lowering everyday costs, making life more affordable, and a good future more attainable. Thank you, Mr. President. I note the absence of a quorum.
Ms. Elsa Brooks. I'm good.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, live Senate coverage of the Save America Act. They're debating on it. As you can see, you have some folks who agree and disagree with whether the Save America Act is good for the American public. You're watching this on the Chop Shop with your nighttime, right time DJ Music. We'll be broadcasting this just for a little bit longer there, folks. And we'll go ahead and end it after that. Like, share, and subscribe if you don't mind. And please be respectful of your comments. Everybody's entitled to their opinion, but you're not entitled to come in and disrespect folks. All right? So with that, we'll keep this up until the next speaker comes in. And for those of you folks that are tuned in right now, also just to remind you that we run a 24-hour internet radio station, Classic R&B Jams. The description for that is down in the listening lounge there in the description box. If you like smooth R&B, classic R&B, smooth jazz, a little bit of house or hip hop, we got it all for you. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Classic R&B Jams Radio. Well, again, men, I don't think it's the fact that people dislike it, because the polls show that most Americans are in favor of most of the portions of the Save America Act. It just has a few things that they believe that would disenfranchise a whole lot of Americans, namely, especially for married women, that they won't be, that their name does not match their birth certificate. And that would disenfranchise, I think someone read the numbers earlier, quite a number of Americans, especially married Americans. Some of it is some pushback, definitely. But again, you're absolutely right with that. The majority of Americans, Democrat and Republican, as well as independents, are in favor of the Save America Act with reservations. And I think that's what they're trying to iron out now. But again, folks, this is live coverage here of the Senate debate on it. We'll try and keep you informed as much as possible. It's always easy to sit back and play armchair quarterback of what these folks are doing. I think it's best sometimes to get it directly from the horse's mouth. That way we can go back later and say, well, they did this, they did that, or we don't have to guess about it because it'll be right here in front of us. Okay. So again, if you're interested, we'll try and do this throughout this Senate coverage at least once a day, or do a recap of it on the weekend. So folks, sit back and relax and enjoy. We'll continue the coverage here as soon as someone starts speaking. What I'll do, folks, is I'll put the link down in the description here for those of you that want to continue watching just live coverage. Go ahead and hit that link. I'll also put it down in the description. I am watching it on, let's see, what channel is this? We are watching the coverage from the Associated Press. I figured that would be the easiest, most efficient people to watch without, you know how they will do, ban your channel or kick you off or something like that. But again, this is government fair use, AP, Associated Press, and anybody else. This is fair use. But again, folks, we'll go ahead and end this now. And we'll come back next when there's some more important information to come up with. Thank you all for watching. Be safe out there.
Look, all you motherfuckers been snitching for him and shit. Now you standing up in here and goddamn it talking about preaching preacher. Fuck that nigga. Fuck that. I'm gonna shoot your ass too, motherfucker. Keep on. You gonna get shot too, nigga. You gonna get shot. God bless the fool, goddammit. God bless the fool. Now, I'm gonna tell y'all something. I'm gonna end this goddamn thing. Look, where's that goddamn money bowl at? Who got that money bowl? We taking that money right now before you leave this bitch. We ain't leaving out here for free, motherfucker. Yeah. Y'all know the motherfucker ain't no good. You want, look,